An 8-year-old girl vanished after every system meant to protect her failed her. She spent her childhood navigating homelessness, instability, and a shelter where a convicted felon was allowed to work around children with no oversight. As her family struggled with generational trauma, her school overlooked repeated absences and accepted inconsistent excuses from her family. By the time anyone realized she was missing, weeks had gone by, and the person she was last seen with had disappeared, his wife had been murdered, and the little girl was gone. Her case remains a haunting example of how a vulnerable child slipped through the cracks created by the people and the systems that should have kept her safe. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalyn. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Relisha's story. Relisha Rudd was born on October 29, 2005 to Shamika Young and Irving Rudd. The family had experienced a lot of generational trauma, so when Relisha was born, Shamika's mother, Melissa, gave Shamika the following advice. Be the best mom you can be because it's easy for your children to go into foster care, but it's hard to get your children back home where they belong. This was a lesson Melissa learned the hard way, and she hoped she could spare her daughter from experiencing the same cycle. Melissa basically raised herself on the streets of Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s during the crack epidemic. Shamika's mother gave birth to her when she was just 17 years old, and at the time, Melissa was addicted to crack and alcohol. For part of her childhood, they lived in a homeless shelter. As Shamika got older, things only got harder. She was diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability as well as emotional and behavioral issues. At 13 years old, she was involuntarily committed to a mental health facility and later went to a group home in Virginia. She remained in the state's care until she aged out of the system. In her first few months in adulthood, Shamika began dating 34-year-old Irving Rudd. In 1992, Irving was convicted of the involuntary manslaughter of one of his 17-month-old twin daughters. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and in 2002, he was released. Irving was 22 at the time of the crime and claimed he accidentally killed his daughter while he was trying to reprimand her for crying. He confessed that he spanked the surviving twin so hard once that it broke her leg. Following his release from prison, Irving got a job as a custodian at Catholic Charities, an organization that provides food, shelter, and mental health services to those in need. It was here that he met Shamika, and within a few months, Shamika was pregnant with Relisha. Shamika was embarrassed about becoming a teen mother and believed she was setting a bad example for her younger sister Ashley, who was 17. But Ashley bonded with Relisha immediately and referred to herself as Relisha's rescue auntie because Relisha would always come crawling to her if she needed something. Shamika was grateful that Ashley liked to babysit because a year later, she was pregnant with her second child. In 2007, Relisha's brother was born, and soon after, Shamika and Irving broke up. Shortly after that, 21-year-old Antonio Wheeler entered their lives. As a child, Antonio struggled with behavioral issues and grew up in a group home. He thought he would never find someone who could relate to his experience, but one day, in 2008, he got onto a city bus and met Shamika and Relisha. When their stop arrived, 2-year-old Relisha ordered Antonio to get off the bus and come home with her and Shamika. 5 months later, Shamika and Antonio moved in together. Antonio played the role of dad to Relisha and her brother since Irving had become an absent father. In 2009, they had a baby boy, and their second son was born the following year. Relisha was nicknamed Little Mama because she acted more like a second mom to her 3 brothers than an older sister. She encouraged them to eat healthy, got their baths ready at night, and always told them to do their homework and get good grades. Despite their best efforts, the family was following the same cycles of generational hardship. In 2012, when Relisha was 6 years old, the family was evicted from their apartment after falling 4 months behind on rent. Shamika, Relisha, and at least one of her siblings began living out of a car. Relisha loved art and drawing as well as cheerleading, being girly, and dressing up. She used these hobbies as a temporary escape. Relisha's cheerleading coach could tell something wasn't right when she noticed that Relisha hadn't been bathing, so her coach did her best to help. Every morning before practice, she took Relisha to the nurse's office to help her clean her clothes, wash up, and do her hair. Eventually, Ashley moved into a one-bedroom apartment and was willing to squeeze in the family of 6. But her landlord was not happy with the arrangement, as Shamika and Antonio were not on the lease. Ashley was on a government subsidy program and couldn't risk losing her lease, so she told Shamika and Antonio that they and the 4 children had to find somewhere else to go. In an interview, Antonio told reporters that Ashley kicked his family out because she didn't like his relaxed parenting style. Regardless, Shamika, Antonio, and their 4 children were once again homeless. This time they contacted a local family resource center for help getting into a shelter, but none of them could take in a family of 6 right away. They spent a year staying at a day's inn provided by the resource center, and finally, in 2013, they received word that there was a spot for them in a shelter. Unfortunately, it was at the DC General Family Shelter. The homeless shelter was the former DC General Hospital. It was the largest shelter in the district, with nearly 270 families and as many as 600 children cramped into just 4 floors. Every family shared a single room, which was small, unrenovated hospital rooms. At times, 2 families had to share one room. DC General was notorious for being unsanitary and unsafe. There were bedbugs, roaches, and mice. Some parents would take turns staying awake at night to brush bugs off their sleeping child's face. Hot water would go out for weeks at a time, and the elevators regularly broke with people still stuck inside. Children constantly passed around ringworm and scabies, and residents reported seeing guns and knives in the shelter. There were even rumors of drug trafficking and sex work in the shelter. Despite the issues, it was the only place that allowed the family to stay together, as other shelters in the area split up men and women. Unsurprisingly, Relisha hated it at the shelter. Whenever she left, she begged not to go back. When she visited her family, she didn't want to leave, and on one occasion, she faked an asthma attack so she could stay longer. At the time, Relisha was a 2nd grader at Payne Elementary School in DC's Hill East neighborhood. Hill East had a high crime rate, but this was the closest school to the shelter. During the 2013-2014 school year, 1 in 5 students enrolled was classified as homeless. She asked her teachers to stay with her after school and even asked if she could sleep at school at night. Relisha was a great student. Her brothers would occasionally get in trouble, but she never would. She paid attention in class, always used her manners, and was popular with her classmates. On February 28, 2014, Relisha was absent from school and no excuse was given. Her attendance was an issue the school was trying to fix, as she had been missing a lot of school. The staff at Payne scheduled a parent-teacher conference for March 5th. The next day, on Saturday, March 1st, her aunt Ashley reported that she'd spent a lot of time with Relisha at her apartment. Relisha and her brother spent a lot of the weekends at Ashley's because they wanted to get out of the shelter. That morning, Ashley did Relisha's hair. Relisha was all smiles when Ashley got out her phone to record a quick video for Shamika. In the video, Relisha smiles as she repeats after her aunt, "We chillin' at Aunt Ashley's house." Shortly after that video was taken, Relisha left Ashley's house. On Monday, March 3rd, Relisha missed school again. Shamika attended the conference regarding her daughter's attendance, and the school told her about support services to ensure Relisha's attendance at school. Despite their efforts, Relisha continued to miss school. The social worker was worried that Relisha was missing so much school, but he wanted to give Relisha's family a chance to prove that her absences should be excused. Relisha had been absent now a total of 30 times that school year. But this time was different because typically her family would send in doctor's notes that excused her absences due to illnesses, but this time there was no note or explanation. The social worker called Shamika to try to get the documentation needed to excuse her absence. Shamika told the school that Relisha was seeing someone named Dr. Tatum for her migraines. The social worker explained that the school needed a letter from Dr. Tatum, and later that week, Relisha's grandmother Melissa brought in a note with Dr. Tatum's number. Melissa denied bringing this note, but the social worker maintains this is where he got this information. The social worker called Dr. Tatum, and he confirmed that Relisha was being treated for neurological issues, and she would be discharged at the end of the week. Dr. Tatum promised he would send over the proper documentation so her absences could be excused. By March 13th, Relisha had 10 unexcused absences, and the school still hadn't received the paperwork from Dr. Tatum. Once a student reached 10 unexcused absences, the school was required to make a report to the Washington, D.C.'s Child and Family Services office. The doctor said he was having trouble with his fax machine, so the school social worker gave him the benefit of the doubt. During the week of March 19th, the social worker made his last effort to get the medical documentation. He spoke with Dr. Tatum and arranged to meet with him later in the day, but Tatum didn't show up for the meeting. The social worker went to the shelter to see if anyone knew where Dr. Tatum's office was, but he was shocked to learn that there was no Dr. Tatum. Instead, there was a 51-year-old janitor at the shelter named Khalil Tatum. The social worker called the Family Services Hotline and reported suspected child abuse. Officers from Washington, D.C.'s police department arrived at the shelter within minutes. The first person they wanted to speak with was Tatum, but he was nowhere to be found. Authorities learned that Tatum had hurriedly left the shelter during his shift that morning after the social worker arranged to meet with him. Every time they called his cell phone, they received his voicemail. Officers began searching the area for him while detectives stayed at the shelter to learn more about Relisha. Investigators pulled Shamika and Antonio into a room in the shelter to question them, and they immediately ran into a huge problem. Her own parents were not being helpful in the investigation. Shamika seemed angry and insisted that Relisha was perfectly safe. She told them a completely different story than the one she told the social worker from the school. She told the social worker that Relisha was being treated in a hospital out of state, but now she was telling police that she was with Dr. Tatum at a medical conference in Atlanta. She told police that she had spoken with Relisha on the phone 2 days prior on March 17th, and she had last seen her in person on March 8th, just before Relisha and Dr. Tatum left town. Shamika's mother, Melissa, told investigators she thought Relisha was with Dr. Tatum too. She claimed she spoke with Relisha on the phone earlier that day, and that she was supposed to pick up Relisha from Tatum's apartment that evening, but had gotten delayed. At this point, authorities didn't know if Melissa was lying or if she really did think Relisha was at Tatum's apartment. They could not verify the claims that Melissa and Shamika spoke on the phone with Relisha recently. No one else had seen Relisha since the beginning of March. The shelter was supposed to do nightly bed checks where they went into each room to confirm who was in each family's room. However, the staff admitted the searches weren't as thorough as they were supposed to be. Staff only knocked on the doors and asked how many kids were inside, so they had no idea when Relisha was last there. Investigators were pretty sure Shamika and Melissa were hiding something, and they had to figure out why. They started digging to figure out who Khalil Tatum is. They learned that Tatum had become a part of Relisha's life in the months before her disappearance. Like every DC General employee, Tatum had signed a non-fraternizing policy when he was hired, but some residents said Tatum was known to give gifts and pay special attention to his favorite residents, especially young girls, and Relisha was one of his favorites. He offered her gifts, including a tablet and a manicure, and spent time alone with her. Relisha even called him her god daddy. Ashley and Melissa said similar things about Tatum. They both said Shamika had been referring to him as Relisha's godfather, and that Shamika allowed him to take Relisha off shelter grounds alone. It first started with daytime activities like trips to the national monuments in the area, but it quickly transitioned to longer trips away. Ashley said that she first met Tatum when he came by himself to pick Relisha up from her apartment. She had no idea how Tatum even got her address and didn't want Relisha to go with him. So she called Shamika, who insisted it was okay. Ashley still thought it was weird as this was the first time she was hearing about Tatum, But she didn't want to make a big deal out of it because she was afraid Shamika would keep Relisha from seeing her in the future, so she let Relisha leave with Tatum. Shamika didn't tell Ashley that Tatum was the custodian at the shelter. She found that out through the police when Relisha went missing. Melissa said Shamika allowed Tatum to babysit frequently, sometimes overnight at his place with him and his wife Andrea. Melissa admitted she was uncomfortable with this at first, but after spending some time with Tatum, she began trusting him. Melissa did know that Tatum worked at the shelter, as she often picked the kids up from school and dropped them off at the shelter, so she did run into Tatum at times. One thing Melissa noticed about him is that he never offered to take the boys anywhere. He only ever took Relisha. Shamika told a different story. She said she never let Tatum watch Relisha unsupervised. When pushed, she blamed Melissa for sending Relisha to Tatum's apartment overnight. Antonio backed up Melissa and Ashley's claims and pointed the finger at Shamika for allowing Tatum to babysit, though he said he didn't know she was allowing Relisha to spend nights and weekends at Tatum's apartment. He had a job installing carpet at the time and had to travel across several states, so he wasn't always at the shelter to see where the kids were going and who they were with. Tatum grew up in the D.C. area. By the time he was a late teen, he had a criminal record that included breaking and entering, burglary, and larceny. He was incarcerated for 2 long stretches from 1993 to 2003 and 2004 to 2011. When he was released, he applied to work for the nonprofit that managed the D.C. General Shelter. Given his criminal record, it was a job he should have never been hired for. He had been married to his wife Andrea for 23 years. He spoiled her with gifts and jewelry, and he was a loving father to his adult stepchildren and to the children he shared with Andrea. The couple told their friends they hoped to retire in 10 years and devote themselves to public service. Andrea volunteered with Washington, D.C.'s homeless population through the church she was a part of. Tatum wanted to focus on mentoring young men and teach them the things he wished he had learned from a young age. Many of their friends looked up to them for overcoming addiction, incarceration, and poverty. On the outside, the Tatums appeared to have the perfect life, but behind closed doors, in February 2014, just weeks before Relisha went missing, Tatum quietly filed for divorce. The authorities felt certain that Tatum was the key to finding Relisha. They called in backup, and the FBI joined the efforts the next day. The FBI found surveillance footage from a Holiday Inn Express located 2.5 miles from the shelter. The video is time-stamped February 26th, 3 days before Relisha was last seen by Ashley. In the video, Tatum and Relisha are seen walking together down the hall, both carrying shopping bags. They appear to go the wrong way as Tatum touches Relisha's shoulders to turn her around, and they find the door they are looking for. Tatum pulls out a key, opens the door, and the two walk into the hotel room together. Investigators started searching all the hotels in the area, thinking if Tatum stayed in one local hotel, perhaps he stayed in others. Meanwhile, the team back at D.C. General was still struggling with Shamika. She was refusing to file a missing persons report for her 8-year-old daughter who hadn't been seen in weeks. She was insisting that Relisha was safe and was not missing, but she couldn't or wouldn't tell the police where she was. A missing persons report was filed anyway without Shamika's help. Police decided not to make a public announcement about the disappearance as they believed Tatum was already spooked, as he had suddenly left work during his shift, and they believed the public attention would just scare him even more. But by March 20th, authorities knew they needed the public's help. They didn't know where to look for Tatum and Relisha, and they needed a tip to help them progress in the search. An Amber Alert was triggered, and the police received the tip they needed. Early in the morning of March 20th, Tatum's red SUV was spotted at a Red Roof Inn in Prince George County in Maryland, about 12 miles from the D.C. General Shelter. Law enforcement quickly swarmed the hotel, hoping to find Relisha. Instead, they found the body of 51-year-old Andrea Tatum. She was lying face down on the bed with one fatal gunshot wound to the head. Tatum was nowhere to be found. Authorities reviewed the hotel's records and interviewed witnesses to piece together what had happened. At some point in the evening of March 19th, Andrea told her adult daughter that she was going to a hotel because the heat in her apartment wasn't working. At 10:04 p.m., both she and Tatum checked into a room at the Red Roof Inn. There were 3 adults with them, but Relisha wasn't with them. The 3 adults left an hour and a half later, shortly before midnight. The next morning, around 5:40 a.m., one of the adults returned to give Tatum a ride. He wouldn't let them into the room, but when the door cracked open, the friend spotted Andrea laying face down on the bed. The friend didn't notice that Andrea was dead. The friend then drove Khalil to a metro station and dropped him off at 6 a.m. The other adults that were with Andrea and Khalil at the Red Roof Inn have never been identified. By now, police believe Tatum was capable of murder. They held a press conference confirming Andrea's murder and Relisha's disappearance. They announced that Tatum was the only suspect in Andrea's death. He was already wanted on a charge of a car theft, and after his wife's body was found, he had an additional warrant for his arrest for murder. The FBI and local police offered cash rewards that totaled $70,000 for information on Andrea's murder and Relisha's disappearance. After the press release, news stations began reporting on the cases, and tips began pouring in. The last confirmed sighting of Relisha was received. The tipster said Tatum and Relisha checked into a Days Inn on the night of March 1st, just hours after she left Ashley's house. The hotel clerk remembered checking them in, and someone else saw Relisha walk past the fountain outside the hotel that evening. This time, there was no surveillance footage, but multiple guests remember seeing Tatum wearing a suit and tie. No one reported seeing Relisha leave the Days Inn. One of Tatum's neighbors told the media that she saw Relisha with Tatum leaving his apartment on Saturday, March 15th. Another neighbor said she had seen Relisha at their apartment building and that Tatum implied that she was his niece. Tatum told the neighbor that he and his wife had gone to some sort of resort with Relisha. Upon further investigation, police decided the Days Inn sighting was the last one that they could officially confirm. On March 2nd, Tatum visited a Home Depot just 2 miles away from the Days Inn. He purchased a box of 42-gallon trash bags, a shovel, and lime, which can accelerate decomposition. Relisha was not seen with Tatum during the shopping trip. Later that day, Tatum was seen at the Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, a 700-acre park across the street from Days Inn. Tatum spent a significant amount of time in the park that day. On Thursday, March 27th, the park became the primary focus of the search. Officers, FBI agents, tracking dogs, boats, helicopters, and divers searched every square inch of the park. In the first few days of the search, authorities weren't finding anything. On April 1st, law enforcement decided they needed more help, so they invited nonprofits to help in the search. But only about 40 minutes after the volunteers entered the park, they were told to suspend their operations and leave immediately. The police had discovered a body. On the morning of April 1st, 6 days into the large-scale search of the Kenilworth Park, police opened a shed at the park and found Tatum's body. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head with the same gun that was used to kill his wife. Forensic investigators were not able to determine when he died, but they determined that he had been dead for at least 36 hours. They still hadn't found a single piece of evidence connected to Relisha, and the only person of interest in her disappearance was now dead. The police promised they were not closing the case and they would never give up until Relisha was found. But family members, advocates, volunteers, and the media say the activity on her case has nearly stopped since Tatum's body was found. In September 2014, the District of Columbia released a report discussing how the system may have let Relisha down. It detailed how a convicted felon was hired to work at a family shelter, the school officials delayed their mandatory reporting obligations, and the shelter staff failed to notice that Relisha had not been there for 3 weeks. The report made several recommendations for policy change for the future, but it concluded that there was nothing more that either Child and Family Services or Payne Elementary School could have reasonably done. In an interview in 2014, Shamika said she trusted Tatum, saying, quote, "He didn't look like that type of person. He looked like a good person. The way he played with everybody's kids, the way he did his job." People who knew Shamika said she always had a reason to explain why Relisha wasn't around. The same year, a cousin spoke with a news station and explained, quote, "I want to know why Shamika is telling us so many different stories about the case and not being honest." Shamika's last interview was in 2017 on the Steve Wilkos Show. She was greeted with boos from the live audience as she walked on stage. For the show, Melissa and Antonio took a polygraph test, but Shamika refused. To the crowd and her family members, refusing the test was an admission of guilt. While on stage, she got into an argument with the host. She was called a bad mom, then was kicked off stage. After this interview, Shamika has stayed away from the press. According to her mother, she instead focused her efforts on getting her high school diploma. Antonio also found himself in an interview that portrayed him negatively. In one interview, a journalist asked him what he had to say to the people who say Relisha's family failed her. Antonio responded, quote, "I'm her stepdad. I'm not her family. I've got kids with her mom, but I'm not her family." Antonio's cold feelings towards his stepdaughter made people believe he was capable of selling Relisha into trafficking. After her disappearance, Antonio began posting photos with a lot of cash on social media. Police believed he couldn't have gotten the money from anything other than trafficking Relisha. The police disagree with the trafficking theory. It wasn't a secret that Relisha was miserable in the shelter, and they believe she would have walked away with the first person who promised her an escape. They believe Tatum was that person and that he killed her and hid her body somewhere that the police will never find. In the midst of her disappearance, Shamika and Antonio separated. Relisha's brothers were removed from Shamika and Antonio's care and were placed in foster care with the goal of eventually reuniting them with their parents. This wasn't the first time the Child and Family Services Agency had contact with Shamika's children. When Relisha went missing, the Child and Family Services Agency had an active case open on the family, and there were 3 prior cases dating back to 2007 when Relisha was just 1 year old. Through the investigations, the agency learned that Shamika's children weren't being adequately fed, their home environment was filthy, the children were left unsupervised in what the agency described as environmentally unsafe conditions, and that Relisha may have been physically abused and Shamika medically neglected one of her children. The investigations into possible child abuse and/or neglect prior to Relisha's disappearance were eventually dropped, and the agency didn't step in to help the children until after Relisha disappeared. After a lengthy battle, a judge ruled that the boys should stay in foster care. Irving also filed for sole custody of his child, but he was only allowed visitation. Shamika was investigated by a grand jury for possible obstruction of justice charges because of her inconsistent statements about her daughter's whereabouts, but in the end, no indictments were issued. Relisha's disappearance was the beginning of a long process that led to the D.C. General Shelter closing. The shelter officially closed their doors in 2018. Ashley and Melissa hope Relisha is alive somewhere. 2 of her brothers recently gave interviews for the first time, and they shared how they remembered Relisha as the loving little mama who always told them to bathe, eat healthy, do their homework, and get good grades. They will never give up on finding their sister. Relisha would be 20 years old today. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Relisha's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and follow Without a Trace on social media. And join me next week as I dive into another case.